I, 25 years old female, have been working as a biomedical scientist in a small local hospital for 4 years now, and this story is the reason I've been searching for a new job. Working in healthcare can be overwhelming, but I use it to manage just fine, up until 5 months ago, when they decided to move us due to renovations. For months, our lab was situated on the ground floor of a modest, separate building that we shared with the dentist's office. I could tell you a lot about the creepy dentist, but that's a different story for another day. The real action, however, occurs on the main hospital building, a large 3-story facility equipped with everything from urgent and surgical care to maternity and pediatric wards. This layout had its advantages, as this separation from the rest of the hospital units allowed our shifts to remain peaceful no matter what chaos erupted in the main building, and with fewer demands during downtime, I was rarely disturbed after midnight. Still, I was genuinely excited when I found out we were temporarily moving into the main building. For the first few months, it was a pleasant change. Being pulled out of isolation made me more sociable, and I started enjoying lunch breaks with my coworkers more often. And before I knew it, I was spending most of my shift socializing outside the lab. The only thing that bothered me was that the lab had now been relocated to the basement, and as someone with breathing issues, I found it suffocating to be down there. With no windows, the air was constantly heavy, thick with chemical fumes and the lingering stench of decaying blood and other disgusting bodily fluid. On top of that, the basement had ongoing power issues. There was just enough electricity to keep the lab running, but not enough to stop the hallway lights from flickering or going out entirely. Eventually, I got into the habit of switching on my flashlight before even heading downstairs, already expecting it to be dark. Another problem was the door situation. The basement door was usually left wide open, while the lab could only be locked from the inside. It all felt far from protocol, but despite our concerns, there wasn't much we can do. It was supposed to be temporary. That night, I came in for my shift and greeted my coworker. We chatted about how his day went, while also updated me on whatever he thought I needed to know. I put my things in the dressing room and we left together. He was going home and I was heading upstairs to see which of my friends were on duty that night. It was Sunday and things were quiet, so we used the time to catch up. We sat there in the resting room, sharing some pizza and gossip, when we heard some loud shouting coming from the urgent care ward. We paid it no mind, as it was very common with patients' caregivers to get into altercations with the staff. It is unfortunate, but with both parties extremely stressed, it can easily escalate into calling the police. When the nurse arrived, we quickly realized this wasn't a routine case. A well-known troublemaker had come in with a shallow, self-inflicted cut on his arm. When the nurse began to stitch him up, he immediately demanded to be drugged. He claimed the injury came from a gang fight, but neither the nurse nor the doctor believed him. His story just didn't add up, and his eyes gave him away. Frustrated, he began to escalate, raising his voice and trying to intimidate them. But the doctor, a big, burly man with no patience, stood his ground. He eventually quieted down, but his glare didn't fade. He stared at them the entire time they worked, unblinking, as if he was carving their faces into his memory. I was a bit shaken at first, hearing her describe the terror of dealing with such unstable people, but before I knew it, we were back to gossiping and playing card games. At 3 a.m., the hospital fell quiet, and I took it as my sign to go to sleep. The basement light was as dim as ever, and the heavy door made a loud noise before shutting the ward behind me. The lab's door was open as always, but the second I locked it behind me, a deep sense of dread filled me. I looked around, and the storage rooms were all wide open, except one that was slightly ajar. At first, I didn't give it a second thought, but as I walked towards it, a flicker of movement made me stop in my tracks. A man was hiding in the darkness, peeking at me from behind the door with a manic look in his eyes. His face was gleaming with evil, and he seemed to be trying very hard not to giggle out loud. My heart sank, and I froze. I stood there for longer than I should, weighing my options. It was dark, but his silhouette was unmistakably large, and there was no chance I could defend myself against him. I don't know how long it took for me to turn around and book it for the door, but when I did, I ran as fast as I ever did. I could hear him coming behind me, his heavy footsteps shaking the earth beneath me, igniting a new level of terror in me. I can't tell you when I stopped running, for that whole segment is a continuous nightmare in my memory. I think I only started breathing again when I was safe in my colleagues' company, shielded by them from whatever that evil man had in store for me. Sadly, the story doesn't end here. I learned later that the man was so strong that it took more than just the security guards to detain him. One male nurse in particular, who was helping disarm him, got a nasty scar on his arm from that altercation. And once the police showed up, they treated him like a regular, like they were so used to him committing crime, they now joke about when they will be called to arrest him again. It was an added layer of trauma for all the staff that night. I have been on mental health leave for a while, but I'm just still expected to move on. No one has answers to whose fault it is that he's knocked down and hid in the lab, and no one knows what he intended to do, except that he had a large knife and an affinity for violence. What is even more tragic is that after this incident, the administration finally got us a new door that looks from both sides to increase security. But it all feels like it's not enough. I also heard that he had been released and is now roaming free, perhaps looking for a new victim, or maybe waiting for the day he gets us all. I carry the image of those gleaming manic eyes with me every day. It's etched in the back of my brain. I haven't taken a night shift since, and I doubt I ever will. You never really know what's waiting for you in the dark, hiding just behind the closed door, waiting for you to step inside. I'd heard ghost stories my entire life, friends swapping tales at sleepovers, relatives whispering about strange family encounters, but I never believed any of it. It always seemed to me like a product of an overactive imagination. That changed, however, when I started working as an ICU nurse at an old hospital. This place was built decades ago, on top of some desecrated cemetery by the edge of town. It was a considerable distance from the residential area, and while getting to it was a challenge, most people were thankful for that space, as if they believed it kept whatever was wrong with the hospital from reaching them. It was also being constantly renovated, sometimes due to a fire or leak, but other times a mad mayor decided he didn't like the front, so he would order half of it down just to rebuild it in the same uncanny manner. I, for myself, didn't connect the dots at first. The restlessness of that place never escaped me when I was young, but it took me working there to understand the length of it. You see, once you set foot in that hospital, perhaps it is the blue painted walls or the long, stuffy corridors that immediately fill you with a sense of dread. It is easy to mistake it for the vulnerability one experiences in such setting, but do not get it twisted. If you walk down the hallway long enough, you will undeniably feel it. This hospital has a thing. There were a few spots with a lot of energy built in. The type you feel goosebumps just passing by, and if you're by yourself, you might hear whispers or some other noise. And for most of the staffs, those places were identified and avoided. Nothing, however, could come close to the static room. It was room 102 in the ICU unit. The room itself was unremarkable, sterile and bare, washed in the harsh fluorescent lights with a small window set off to the side of the bed. Yet, there was something unsettling about it. The atmosphere there felt more intense. The air was always cold and heavy, carrying suffocating weight of decay, even when the room had been untouched for months. Some nurses told me stories about how the patient would start acting strange as soon as they got put in there. They also began seeing their deceased loved ones and would often talk about joining them soon. And before you know it, their prophecy would come true, and they would be gone. Sometimes a patient would be stable and their condition would be looking up. But once they changed into the static room, they would undoubtedly get worse. But those were still just rumors, and I shrugged them off to the sleepless nights and the stress of the workload. That didn't stop me, however, from following their instructions, and for months while I worked there, I too stayed away from that room. Until one day, I had to use it. I won't bore you with the details, but there was an incident that took our town by surprise, and a lot of people rushed to the hospital. The ICU unit was filled to the brim, and when a new patient was hospitalized, We had to put him in that room. The staff joked that he was scarier than whatever ghost was haunting that chamber. And they were right. He was an old man in his 60s whose alcohol addiction took a toll on his health. He was mean, violent, and would often try to punch whoever came near him. The nurses avoided him like the plague. And when I first started working with him, he tried to do the same to me, but I dodged it and told him that the next time he's gonna try something, I will stab him with my needle in the eye. He laughed, and since then, he'd been a changed man. He still caused chaos whenever the other nurses came to see him, but on my shift, he was well behaved and would randomly open up about his life. He told me he was married, had been cheated on, and didn't find out until his wife ran off with her lover, taking all his money with her. His eyes would fill up with rage whenever he talked about her, and he'd start blaming her for everything that happened to him since. I used to listen to him and not feel bad for him, as he reminded me of my grandpa. I believe I must have reminded him of someone too, because he'd look up to me and say, "Why do you even work here? This place sucks," and we would both laugh. As the days passed by, his condition worsened, and he started fading. He became quieter, his eyes unfocused, and I knew his body was shutting down. One night, as I walked to his room, he was struggling to breathe. My eyes teared up at the sight of his frail, pale face. I don't know what made me say it, but I put my hand on his shoulder and whispered, "It's okay. You don't have to fight anymore. You can be free." Hours later, he was gone, but it didn't stop there. For days following his death, the room remained empty, and as soon as I walked into my shift that day, I knew something was off. The nurses complained to me that the man's spirit must still be in that room. I didn't take them seriously at first, until I passed by it. That's when I felt it. There was an energy of violence and upset that was hard to ignore, like a black cloud emanating and swallowing the room. The equipment was also acting up. Machines that weren't even plugged in kept beeping, and the lights flickered. Then things started getting weirder. An assistant who was sent in there to fetch something fainted for no reason. I recall watching all of that unfold and deciding I had to do something. So I went to the room, locked the door, and stood near the bed. His presence was undeniable. I looked around and said, "You're free, but why are you still here? I thought you said this place sucks. Don't you have an ex-wife to torment or something?" There was a long silence, and I held my breath, expecting the worst. I just scolded the ghost, and I had no idea how they would retaliate. It seemed like forever, then suddenly, the window abruptly opened, and everything stopped. The air was no longer stuffy, and the machines calmed down. I stood there for a while, feeling a deep sense of relief wash over me. I realized in that moment that not only was the hospital haunted, but I carried that with me too, and when it stopped, I could finally breathe deeply again. I never told anyone what I did in that room. I think I was afraid of being perceived as crazy, but since then, I have never questioned it when I hear a ghost story, because spirits do hang around, not because they enjoy messing with us, but because they don't know what to do, and sometimes it helps to tell them that it is okay to let go. This story happened decades ago. I had just graduated from med school with honors and was immediately assigned to a new state hospital in a small town in eastern Morocco. From the start, I knew this would only be a temporary gig, a way for me to earn as much money while spending very little. But it turned out to be harder than I thought. See, I grew up in a small village myself, spent my childhood plagued with poverty and illiteracy around me. I worked hard to get out, believed I left that life behind, but this job dragged me right back into it. And for 2 years, I worked in urgent care, and it was one hell of a nightmare. The townspeople were such a pain. They'd come in, half dead, ask for help, then ignore everything I told them. Diabetes was their favorite pastime. I told the same old Joe to cut out sugar, only for his family to bring him a giant cup of tea with 10 sugar cubes. A few months later, he'd come back, his eyesight declining, but never his sugar cravings. After a while, I just stopped caring. If they are willing to lose their limbs and legs, who am I to object to that? Then, a position was suddenly available in the pediatric unit, and I immediately applied for it. I was told upfront we'd be short-staffed, so we'd need to stay sharp and keep things tight. Luckily, the team pulled their weight and then some, and for the first few weeks, everything ran like clockwork. But eventually, even in that small corner of hell, something just had to happen. You see, the town had its superstitions, stories that are passed around often, that everyone knows of, yet no one speaks out loud. Most people don't even recall who told them, and neither did I. One tale that used to be thrown around a lot was that the cats are stealing from the morgue. Now, to be frank, the cats in that hospital were definitely huge and appeared to be well fed, but the idea that they were feeding on the dead was an unbelievable stretch. That night, I was deep into my shift when I got called onto the maternity ward. A newborn was having trouble breathing, so I took over his care. As I asked for the guardian, I was directed to a small, frail young woman sitting alone in one of the rooms. The hallway around her was alive with joy. Laughter spilled from the other rooms, where the new mothers, surrounded by friends and family, shared their first moments with their newborns. But her room was tucked away at the far end of the corridor, isolated from the warmth that filled the air. When she looked up at me, her gaze was empty, distant, like she had no one left to turn to. Her face was pale, still marked by the tool of labor, and the midwives who came and went seemed to treat her with a quiet, almost invisible indifference. It was as if she existed in a different universe, one where the joy of new life had somehow passed her by. I later learned that she was a single mother, possibly a runaway, and I explained the unspoken judgment she was receiving from the townspeople. Their disdain was palpable, and though I prided myself on maintaining a strict, professional demeanor, something in me stirred. Perhaps it was the desire to stand apart from the cruelty and ignorance of those around me, while I found myself stepping into a role I hadn't planned on. In that moment, I realized my actions might have been driven by vanity. I wanted to feel superior to those who touched her, so I became a bit too familiar, crossing the lines I usually kept firm. I found myself smiling at her more often, throwing in jokes whenever I checked on her baby. Sometimes I even stopped by when there was no real need to, just to see how she was doing. I couldn't say for sure if the nurses and midwives noticed the blurred lines, but as I did it, I kept hyping myself up for being the more progressive, compassionate one amongst my peers, making me feel like an unsung hero of some sort. By her third night at the hospital, she looked rejuvenated. I visited her one final time to go over the care instruction for their baby. I even bought medicine for them both out of my own pocket and told her it came from the hospital. She thanked me, and I wished I could do more, but I didn't want to push any boundaries any further. She was due to leave the next morning, so imagine my shock when later that night, the baby was placed in my unit. I remember the nurse walking in with an unreadable expression. She placed the baby in one of the cribs and simply said, "He's an orphan now." There was a brief, frozen silence. I asked her why, and she shrugged. "Infection," she said. "That's what the doctor said." So who were we to question it? The news hit me like a brick. I couldn't explain it, but something about her sudden demise disturbed me deeply, gnawing at me in ways I couldn't shake. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to sleep. At some point, moments before dawn, I decided to step outside for a smoke. The hallway was still, and the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp, shifting shadows along the walls. As I walked down the corridor and past the small alcove on the right, where the morgue sat, half concealed in the wall, I was stopped in my tracks. The morgue, usually sealed, was slightly ajar, swaying just enough to let out a faint creak. I turned, a prickling unease creeping across my skin, and waited for a moment. And that's when I heard it. From the darkness inside came a low, strained whimper, soft but unmistakable. For a moment, my mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps a staff member had been struggling with some heavy load, or maybe someone got injured. So I decided to investigate. I moved slowly, the air turning solid in my lungs, while the loud pounding in my chest blocked all sounds from registering. As I reached the door, I held my breath, aimed my flashlight, then pushed it open fully. What I saw on the other side still haunts me to this day. Inside the morgue, I saw her lying on one of the metal beds. Her skin was pale, her body unnervingly still, yet the faint whimpers escaping her lips told a different story. She wasn't dead, she was trapped. Her panic was palpable, as if she was begging for a mercy that wasn't coming. The helplessness in her eyes, glazed over by silhouette, tore through me like a knife. I was about to walk in to head towards her when something caught my eye, a movement in the corner, and my brain immediately registered that something was wrong. It took me a while to understand what I was staring at, and by the time I did, I was already paralyzed with fear. There was a feral, animal-shaped creature crouched low on the shadows by one of the other metal beds. The room was dim, and my flashlight was hardly reaching, but the shape stood out clearly, large, twisted, and what looked like a big tail wagging behind, almost like a large, monstrous cat. I was mortified, and I stood there, staring for a while, trying to make sense of the scene. The sounds I was hearing slowly registered in my brain, chewing and slurping, and a pool of blood, barely visible from underneath the creature's clawed paws. I don't know what sound I must have made, because it turned toward me eventually, its face dripping red, while it shamelessly continued chewing, and when we locked eyes, they were familiar, eyes I was certain I saw every day. It's not human, and it wasn't an animal. This was something much more cursed, something you're not supposed to survive, and I barely survived it too. The creature made a screeching noise and started advancing towards me, slowly but surely, and that's when I screamed. I screamed like a little girl, and I'm not embarrassed to say it, but I have never understood fear more than I did that day. If my heart had stopped right then and there, I would have been okay with it, but instead, it kept on beating, even though I felt like I was going to pass out. At some point, the creature stopped advancing and started shrieking in return. Thinking about it now, I recognize the humor of that scene. Me crying out for my dear life while the monster hollered back because it got caught. And in a miracle of some sort, instead of charging at me, the monster chose to run past me and disappeared into the night. I was unmoved, trembling, drenched in sweat. I even cried and remained in place until security came. A few hours later, I went to deliver my report. And that's when things got even more absurd. Rather than receiving the answers, I needed to have some peace. I was faced with discrimination. See, admin just had the audacity that keeps on going, and instead of explaining to me why that woman, still alive and breathing, had been declared dead, or what was that thing, the one hunched over a pool of blood, consuming the raw human flesh, like the aftermath of a violent crime scene, I got reprimanded. They questioned what I was doing out by myself in the mortuary and claimed they had some staff reporting an alleged inappropriate relationship with the patient. They also brought in some unfounded claims of my negligent work, and that's the moment I knew I had to take the L. According to them, the woman's death certificate, being signed by her doctor under the supervision of her nurse, was an innocent mistake. But me, I was facing allegations of inappropriate misconduct, and I was immediately placed on leave. I took them gladly, as I wouldn't survive had I been forced to take another shift, while the familiar, monstrous eyes still plagued my vision. The aftermath of this story is quite unfulfilling. I was transferred, luckily, within a month or two, to a more urban area. It turned out the admin pushed for that transfer to come sooner, and I was grateful. Adjusting to my new job was easier than I expected, but the damage has already been done. The paranoia sits in deep, and I could never trust people the way I once did. I tried therapy, sought out answers, but nothing felt certain. My only theory, the one that still haunts me the most, is that I came face to face with something beyond reason. A ghoul, a monstrous shapeshifter that feeds on the dead. But even that explanation doesn't sit right with me. I still don't understand why that poor woman was left in there, nor who those uncanny eyes belong to. I've come to terms with the fact that I'll never have answers. I don't know what happened to that woman or her baby, but I can only hope they both found a way out of that terrifying place, away from whatever horrors lingered there.